Pretty fun.
All right, well, maybe we'll start. And I'm again, as you've been with some of these meetings, I'm speaking into a microphone that's not projecting, but it's internally recording our conversation. So I'm not looking funny up here, or you're wondering why I'm holding a microphone. I'm sure other people will drift in, but just to use our time to its fullest, I'm going to, for the sake of the recording again, introduce myself, Ruth Pizzuara, the Artistic Director at the Art Colony, and I'm so glad that you're all here. We have a timely and vital conversation and an opportunity to talk with Jack Becker, founder of Forecast Public Art, and this whole opportunity to have him come our way kind of spun out after our last full meeting and being able to think about this process we are confronted with of what does public art look like in our community. And my good friend and board member Lynn Speaker said you should call Jack Becker and see if he could come. And Jack happened to be coming to Duluth today anyway, so he took the extra 2-hour drive up our way and is with us until 2:30. So this is really a conversation discussion, but first to give just a very brief, I'm going to try my best at explaining the Cultural Economic Collaborative here, and we can continue talking about that for Jack's benefit. Outline a little bit of our agenda and then introduce Jack so you have a sense of who our conversation partner is. Before we do that, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off or down. And so of course most of you have been involved in the CEC and know where we've come from. It evolved over a number of years of good conversations that were cross-sector about our artistic rootedness, our creative rootedness, and hopes for economic development in those regards. And it was galvanized through the Blandin Foundation leadership cohort that recognized an issue area in our community of creative economic development, and more recently was then named the CEC. A group is responsible for spearheading the cultural plan that lives on the EDA site and is accessible there, and then most recently has been named the Arts Advisory Commission to the city. It's an open group that continues to meet, and anyone can join and sit in on meetings. And of course, we've been presented with this most recent project of working with CJ Fernandez, and as he's the architect contracted with MnDOT to figure out the amenities for the Highway 61 redesign. And so it's just propelled us into this next phase of, what does public art look like? We don't have a formalized process of RFPs or call for artists or a juried process for public art as a community. And that's some of the work ahead of us. And this particular project has made it more immediate for us to consider what that looks like. So our agenda is really for Jack to introduce us and kind of overview Forecast and the work of Forecast, what that is about, and talk with us about those first steps our group can take to lay some foundation, what direction we want to take public art, and what frameworks might work well for us, and then in particular, with regards to the Highway 61 amenities project. So just so you know, I've shared with Jack our cultural plan, and he did have in advance the redesign layout and has it here today. I've shared with him our draft memorandum that is still in the works and will eventually go to the city with our recommendations. So then I'll just introduce you, Jack, and then we'll get started. So Jack, again, is the founder of Forecast Public Art, which was founded in 1978. And he now serves as director of Forecast Consulting and Creative Services Program. Forecast fosters dynamic, inclusive, and resilient communities through public art, community-engaged design, and transformative place-making. For 40 years, they have improved the collective life of communities through a unique combination of responsive consulting services, rare one-to-one support for public artists, and abundant resources, including the Public Art Review that is the world's leading public art journal, and it's being circulated around the table. So we have someone who's an expert in this area sitting with us today, and it's just it's an honor to have you. Jack also has an art background himself, having graduated from MCAD, and is just thoroughly steeped, in this world. Hey, Betsy, come on in. So as we get started, again, Jack has a microphone, and then as we converse, we will pass. We have 2 other microphones.
We just have one.
Oh, we have 1 now. Okay, so I can be the runner, and we'll just pass this around so that everybody can be heard on the recording for those who aren't there. So thank you for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Do you want to have everybody say their names for the recording?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Jim, you want
And
to
for
start?
my benefit, again, I am terrible with names, just so you know.
Sure,
Yep.
let's do that.
Jim Sanderud.
Dave Quick.
John Books.
Lynn Speaker.
Greg Wright.
Betsy Bowen.
Eric Humphrey.
Jerry Grant.
Mary Somnus.
Greg Mueller. Ron Piercy.
I'm good, thanks.
And that's
Ron.
good.
And Jack Becker. I have a mic. Oh, you have? Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, I didn't mean to say I don't want the mic. This is really exciting for me to be able to be here, and even more so now that I've learned what's going on in Grand Marais. At first it was just, do you want to come to Grand Marais, meet some people, and then it was sort of, and here's a document, and here's a document, and here's this amazing, cultural plan that's been worked on, and I think it was Sharon Rodney Bash, who I've known for many years and have great respect for, and it's really refreshing, to see such a progressive approach to planning and the arts in a place that's really special on my favorite lake in the world. So it's got a lot going for it right now, and I'm just glad to be here. I thought what I'd do is give you a little bit of background about myself, how I even got involved in this field of public art, and then the trajectory since starting Forecast back in '78 that has sort of led up to where I am now and where the organization is now as a nationally known resource. And I love how you said it's, the internationally renowned or the leading magazine. It's the only magazine on public art, so I guess just by default, it's the leading magazine. When I graduated from MCAD, I had an interest in sculpture and interdisciplinary work, and I had a bit of a theater background, so visual art, theater background, and really wanting to do more projects with other artists. That was my thing, rather than go solo and be isolated in a studio. And there was a CETA program that came up in 1977. The CETA was a federal job training program that put some 60 artists to work in Minneapolis for 1 year. CETA stands for Comprehensive Employment Training Act. So it was kind of like the WPA of the 70s, and there were CETA programs around the country that it was a jobs program, but not many of them were focused on helping artists find jobs. We're also in that category of, underemployed and sometimes underskilled, in terms of if you just have a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, what kind of jobs can you get? And so many artists, as we know, support their creative livelihood through some straight job or some other job that's not necessarily playing to their strengths as a creative individual. And so there's 60 artists in the program, and I had the special assignment with a desk and a phone at the City Hall in Minneapolis, at the Minneapolis Arts Commission, of gallery director for City Art Productions, which was the nickname for the CETA program. And they showed me my desk, and they said, Jack, there's only one catch. There is no gallery. They said the city is your gallery, and your job is to organize exhibits of CETA artists at the library and the parks and plazas and government center. And here's your desk and phone, now go for it. And I found that I was good at making these connections, partly maybe because I had been doing found object sculpture. And I think there's kind of an awareness that I've grown of an appreciation for bureaucracy as an art form. And bureaucracy is basically about connecting needs and resources in a community. And if you look at the city as your gallery, and the raw material being the places, the people, the industries, and even the cast-off materials from industries, you realize there's a lot of raw material that you could connect to make something happen, right? To connect needs and resources. And being empowered, which I'm telling you, as a young artist, 23 years old, a desk and a phone at City Hall is an empowering experience. You should try it sometime. And I tell artists, if you're trying to get something done in the city, just tell them you're calling from City Hall, because, they're never going to check up on you, and they'll probably return your phone calls, which is what I experienced, more so than when I tried getting stuff done from my studio. So that empowerment that came from the position that I was given by, not total accident, okay, I must have had some skills to be hired in that role. But I found that I was good at making those connections, and the telephone was my best friend, and it was about looking at places in the city as venues for artists' creative expression, and that artists want to reach certain audiences with certain messages, so there are certain spaces that come with certain audiences, and why not connect those artists with those places and those audiences for the kinds of messages that artists might want to be conveying to those audiences. And that kind of connecting and matchmaking really was the nature of the job. It wasn't telling artists what to do, and it wasn't telling communities they had to work with an artist. It was just saying, hey, have you talked to so-and-so, and make those initial connections. And artists are usually looking for opportunities to get visibility for their work, and public spaces offer tons of visibility. And I learned a lot about the field of public art in the process. And I know that public art has really evolved from art in public places to something more process-oriented and more engaging of communities and more relevant in terms of the content of the work, rather than just, I could take the art out of my studio and I could put it in a space that's public, and that's public art, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There are a lot of sculpture walks and sculpture parks that are venues for displaying outdoor sculptures or outdoor murals. But when the mural or the sculpture has something to say about the place it's in and the audience it's being viewed by, there can be a lot more impact. There can be a lot more of a story told. The art can resonate more in the place and convey a sense of meaning that something that's just there to decorate or to, fill an empty space might not. And I've learned that while artists go through school not necessarily learning that the context of a site can inform the content of the work, that's really what I got introduced to at an early stage of my career, and thinking about the democracy we live in and how do people get to participate in public art, because it's not just art in public. And that word public in public art is really important to think about and talk about. And what do we even mean by that? Also, this kind of tension between this notion of public being very out there and open and involving of everyone, and art, which can often mean a kind of personal, private expression that may not be shared by everyone. And what are artists' role in the community, and what could it be, and what kind of job description can artists write for themselves if they were given the opportunity to write their own job description as a public artist? And maybe this hasn't come up a lot in your community. Maybe artists have been given freedom to do all kinds of projects around Grand Marais, or temporary versions, which can be a great way of testing ideas. So I'm a big fan of temporary public art as a way of artists testing ideas in the community, and communities getting to test what do artists do, and not be threatened by the long-term ownership and care and maintenance that comes with the adoption of a permanent work, and who owns it and who takes care of it and what happens if it's falling apart. And so at the end of the CETA program, there really wasn't a job I could step into to keep doing that. even though I would have loved to. So all the 60 artists went on unemployment, I'm pretty sure, because there wasn't a job. But one day I was walking down First Avenue North in the warehouse district, and I noticed a space that was up for rent. And it was this beautiful renovated warehouse space that looked right near where Warm Gallery had just opened. And it was obvious, like, this could be an alternative art space. And I called up my seat of friends and said, "Come, you got to come see this space." And we decided to sublease this 2,500 square foot space on the ground level with a window right out on First Avenue. And we started putting on shows that artists wanted to do in this space. And I realized that it had limitations in terms of what could artists do in a space like that, and it was dependent on people coming to the space, whereas the CETA experience was the opposite. It was, let's bring the art to where people are, and vacant storefronts are available for free in the city. Why are we renting one, was the thought. Even though it was a great space, and there was some shows that were done there, we got to know more of artists and be part of the gallery scene in the late 70s, which was a really interesting time in Minneapolis. But after 10 months, we abandoned that space and started to think about vacant storefronts and outdoor park spaces and going project by project, raising grant money as a nonprofit to do projects and then start over. And can we do catalogs and document the projects? Because we needed to show with temporary things what the evidence of those projects were. So we got good at doing catalogs and publications. And after 10 years of going project by project with very little overhead, because we didn't have a space, and we used to just brag all we needed was a post office box and a telephone, we could run forecasts, and it was the biggest gallery in the city. It had the highest audience attendance, and we were bringing art to huge audiences that galleries and museums couldn't compete with in terms of numbers. But it was also that CETA model of connecting artists with audiences they want to reach in spaces that might be, huge opportunities for the artist as well as the community. So it was a win-win kind of thing, and we actually were able to get funding partly because we were removing barriers to access to the arts. That's what the funders framed us as. How many people actually go to museums and galleries out of the community as a whole? Is it maybe 5% or 10%? We know a lot of people, at least in the Twin Cities, were not going to the Walker or the Art Institute, and that we were basically bringing art to where people were, and that was something new and fundable. But after 10 years, we realized it was labor intensive to go project by project. So we started 2 ongoing programs, and one was the magazine, which McKnight and the Regional Arts Council funded, the first 2 issues, and that was in 1989. And we've been doing 2 issues a year since then. So we're almost at 30 years of publishing Public Art Review, which has now evolved into a full color magazine, and we have a lot of online content. And now we're doing 1 issue a year, and it's a little thicker, and more content online, which is much more accessible to a broader audience. I definitely want to encourage you to check out our website and see some of the content there, and you can access the archives through a partnership we had with the Anderson Library at the university. So all the back issues are available to view, and you can order them. At the same time, in 1989, we've been seeing what Jerome Foundation was funding in terms of re-granting programs. So the Northern Clay Center was re-granting funds to individual clay artists, because they were a clay organization, a playwright center for playwrights, and the law for writers. And we approached Jerome and said, could we have a re-granting program for public art and artists? And instead of going project by project, could we have an annual grant program? And they said, well, what would that look like? So it was one of the nicer opportunities, a foundation asking us, what would you like it to look like? Your grant program for artists in the state of Minnesota. And it's like, that's a nice idea. We started thinking about, what do artists need? And we realized that some artists are emerging in this field, and they really need to just do research and development and not do a project. So one category of funding was just R&D for artists who just wanted to explore an idea and get some support and technical assistance and documentation from forecasts. And the other was for project funding, assuming you've already done your own R&D. So if you had a wall that you knew you could do a mural on and you had permission, you could apply to forecast for funding to do that mural. We also emphasized that it was for career building. And even though these were for emerging artists, it had to be a stepping stone towards something bigger and more career-minded, that you weren't just going to do a one-off public art and then go back to your studio photography career or whatever. And so it couldn't just be a project you'd already done and you want money to do it again. It was, what can you do that takes it to another level? And we started hosting workshops in our space and helping artists and traveling around the state and asking folks like Bob Dorman at the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council, can you host us? We'd like to do a workshop so artists in the Arrowhead region know about our grant program. And I went on a number of those road trips. We still have a challenge of getting artists from greater Minnesota to apply for this grant program, but it's still going strong, and Jerome continues to fund it. And now we also have a mid-career artist category that McKnight Foundation funds. So to make a long story short, after doing the magazine and the grant program for some time, we grew an incredible database of artists, knowing what they could do, and even the ones that applied and didn't get funding, they were still worth noting, because we could only fund, about 20% of the artists who applied. And the magazine was our storytelling device, and we started getting stories about public art and what's happening in other parts of the world, and packaging it, and became, very aware of the field as it was growing and evolving, and started doing book reviews and then amassing a library of books about public art, which still grows today. But what happened in the meantime was people started calling us and asking us for help. Can you help us get an artist at the library? We're building a new library and we want to commission artists. And we realized we could start charging for our advice. And that turned into the consulting program, or the third leg of the stool at Forecast. And I got so enamored of doing the consulting work that I decided I just didn't want to be executive director anymore, and didn't want to just to sit at the desk, running the show. I wanted to get out and work with communities. So 2 years ago, I stepped down as executive director, and Teresa Sweetland took over. She ran Intermedia Arts for a number of years, and I'm focusing on the consulting and creative services area. And so the kinds of projects we do as consultants vary from helping people who want to commission artists and help them develop requests for qualifications, as opposed to, say, requests for proposals, which has become, I would say, less popular these days with artists, because you're not paying the artist to develop a proposal. If you just do a request for qualifications, it's just a one-page letter and some bio information and work samples, and then you get, if you make it to a finalist stage, you get paid to work on a proposal. So that's a two-step RFQ process versus an RFP where you're asking 100 people to do proposals. You're only going to pick one. It's just not really that ethical anymore in the field. But paying artists to develop proposals is actually a really powerful, meaningful exercise to go through, because they can then come engage and do research and meet with people, and the time is put into the design phase that you would want for a compelling public art project anyway. You really don't want a proposal to come from out of left field. They think they know what's going on here, and it really doesn't necessarily connect or have that much meaning. So this RFQ process is something we've developed and have now perfected. It only requires 3 meetings from a selection committee. And the first meeting, just to walk you through our steps, is where we meet with the stakeholder group, the Arts Advisory Committee, or Arts Selection Committee, which we don't put together, but we help clients who may need help with identifying the key stakeholders who need to be around that table, representing the space, the neighbors to the space, maybe audiences for the space. And we talk about that opportunity. Either they have a site in mind or they're looking for help with, at a library, where should we put the art? We only have enough money for one project. Or we have a streetscape, where should the art go and why there? And what kind of art, what costs are involved? And usually they have the money, but it may not be that they can afford what they think. So we try to help them manage their expectations, that maybe a smaller version of that, or a wall piece instead of a sculpture, or something indoor instead of outdoor because it's less maintenance. So that kind of advice has just come from experience, working in this. And that first meeting, we talk about the criteria for the work. What would success look like in the end? What are the eligibility requirements you want? Is it the Arrowhead region? Is it Minnesota as a whole? Is it a national competition? Is it an open call RFQ or an invitational RFQ, in which case we would just shortlist 20 or 30 artists that we know are qualified, and invite them to respond to the RFQ, and you're still going to narrow it down to 3 finalists to maybe work on proposals. Or I've seen it even where let's just interview the finalists, don't ask them to do a proposal, let's just bring them in and talk with them and pick one we want to work with. And I've seen that work too, where you don't actually spend the money on the design phase till you've picked an artist that you've met and you know you want to work with. But the design phase doesn't commit you to go beyond that, because what if that doesn't work out? The second meeting is where we've actually put out the RFQ, which everybody has helped vet, so they all have seen it and have bought into this is what it's going to be and what's going out to artists. It answers all the questions an artist might have. And they have applied, and we have organized that material. At the second meeting, they're looking at the work samples in response to the RFQ. And they're rating them, yes, no, maybe. And they're having discussions around the ones they think are yeses. They're debating those further and maybe looking through the letters and resumes more detailed. And they pick the 3 finalists. If it's a democracy that we use, it's the vote, the majority vote. And if we need to forge a consensus because they're landlocked or not landlocked, gridlocked, thank you. It could be landlocked too, I suppose.
Landlocked is a thing, yeah.
We help forge a consensus to get to those 3 with the understanding, if it doesn't work out, they're not committing, they have to pick one. But if they're on a tight deadline, they hopefully they love all 3, and all of them are going to do really great proposals. And if we're doing our job and everybody's done a good job with developing this thing, all 3 come in and they're all great. We could go with any one of them. But inevitably there's a rating and a criteria that you're using in that third meeting when you interview them and they've developed their proposal, so 6 to 8 weeks later. And at that meeting, it's really between the artists and the selection committee. We're not doing much. We're timekeeping and helping, but the artist is doing what they're supposed to do to convey their ideas and answer questions, right? And you're asking the questions to make sure the artist is, meeting your needs. Is this an artist we want to work with? Are these ideas that really are compelling and fit all of the marks that we said we needed? Did they listen when they did this? Did they do some research? Did they engage any community members in the process of developing? Whatever you're looking for in terms of the right artist to move to the top, and then at the end of that meeting, hopefully, that's the artist we want to commission. And you can either move right into contract, or in some cases, the selection committee is advisory to a city council and it needs to get moved up and recommended before a commission contract would follow. And in our case, we can help with the contract if people need good quality, up-to-date contracts that are ethical for the artists, especially in terms of copyright and appropriate pay. But really, we're not involved that much after that fact, because the artist has a proposal, they're a professional, and they want to move forward. If it's an emerging artist and this is their first project, which I would caution you about with your first project, don't hire an emerging artist who's never done a commission, but don't ignore the possibility of future opportunities for emerging artists, or even having a micro grant program in your own community that is just for emerging artists to try out ideas with a small budget. But again, this model of what is it the artists want to do and where do they want to do it, not we're looking for a mural for this wall, who wants to do that? That's the opposite of this grant program that Forecast has had, and I feel is an effective means of incubating the talent that's in a community. And after doing a number of trainings for artists, we've actually developed a whole training program called Making It Public for artists who want to move their careers from the studio out into the community. I do want to emphasize, though, that public art is not just visual. There are a lot of performing artists participating in the public art field. And we're actually in the process of developing a Making It Public workshop just for performing artists who want to know how to move into that world of spectacle and festival and parades and giant puppets and, mimes on the street corner are the ancient version of that, right? Or the Shakespeare in the park. Nothing wrong with that. Bring your performance out to where the community can access it. But I also want to suggest that public art isn't just static objects in the landscape. It can be places that are meant to be programmed. that are meant to be a stage for lots of different things to happen. Not unlike what an amphitheater is in a public park. If you extrapolate that further and say, the whole city is the gallery, the whole city is also the theater. It's like the black box theater, right? You decide how you want it to be your stage. And I could use the Shakespeare quote here, all the world's a stage and we're all just the players. It's so true. And artists want that visibility and they want the freedoms that they can have outside of traditional venues. Not every artist. And again, they're not all trained to work in this. So there's this remedial education part that's really important. And any good public art program in any city shouldn't just be about commissioning artists to make art for them. It should be about fostering the development of a public art ecosystem in their community. And that ecosystem isn't just about artists, it's also about the allied professionals, the place-based designers like landscape architects and community gardeners and community developers and parks people and city planners. They're all part of the allied professions around this public art field. The community is critical and the audience is critical. So when we do workshops for artists thinking about going into public art, one of the things we get them to think about, and I would advise you on your efforts, who is the audience that you're trying to serve? And what is the goal in terms of the impact you want to have on that audience or multiple audiences? In your case, it might be drive-by audiences as well as pedestrian and bike audiences. It might be residents as well as tourists, as well as people who are coming from Canada down to Duluth for business, and many others. And you can do a whole constituency mapping of who are the audiences for Grand Marais, and are they part of the audience for any public art or artistic activities that are happening in spaces that they might intersect with. So stop me if I'm going too fast or you have questions in the meantime, please. I just want to make sure you understand that in addition to the commissioning process that we do a lot of consulting work on, we've started moving into doing public art master plans, and Duluth was one of our recent clients. We worked on the arts and culture master plan for the DPAC in Duluth, and we realized it shouldn't just be about Duluth. It should be a Twin Ports plan, but we couldn't get the other part of the Twin Ports on board at the time to be, a full participant in it. And we made it really clear it was about creative economy development in Duluth, which it can't just be about public art if they're really looking at larger arts and cultural issues, arts facilities, performance spaces, arts education. Those are not public art planning objectives. That's larger arts and culture planning, which you've already got a really good start on what you need in terms of thinking broadly about arts and cultural development. I understand it's countywide, right? But I'm guessing it's very applicable to what you need locally, and you might want to look at, of that plan, what's really relevant for Grand Marais. You're in the county and the county has a role in this, but the city also does. And they can be complementary, right? You don't need to duplicate what the county might be supporting. You might want to create your own support systems that aren't supported by the county. There are a lot of things we could talk about, but I wanted to at least lay some foundational information out there for you in thinking about this field of public art, where it's going, the value of incubating local talent, but not being afraid, and even welcoming, bringing in outside talent that can help inspire and even educate and train other artists. Because you don't want all your money to go out of state or out of the city, but you also have to look at it as far as what's the best quality of art. We're not just trying to do a local art exhibit here, I assume. So the quality that you're after and the impact that you're after drives the rest of the criteria for any project that you want to do. And there could easily be criteria built into any commissioned project that it needs to engage community in some way, whether it's school children, or communities of color, or indigenous communities here. You can help set the criteria based on what's missing. Where are artists that are underrepresented? What are the stories that need to be told that haven't been told? Isn't public art a great vehicle for doing that and raising awareness of issues that need to be raised? So this mural that's on the cover of Public Art Review, maybe you've seen this mural in Duluth, but you want to hold that up a sec? This mural, I learned the story of this mural. The artist said that we risk getting arrested when we protest. So this mural is a kind of protest that can't get arrested. I thought, that's brilliant. You got your message out there in a way that somebody can't say, hey, I don't like that. Too bad. This is a message that needs to be heard. Not everybody's going to agree with anything you put up. I just want to warn you there. And public art gets very political very quickly. And if you're trying to please everyone, you probably shouldn't be going into the public art field. Probably some other kind of field, because it isn't about trying to get everybody to agree or to have everybody's input and water it down. The artistic vision is a really important thing to honor in any public art process, but it isn't the only thing. And so I like to think about public art as the intersection of the artist's creativity and talents and energies with the community's needs and opportunities and concerns. And if the artist isn't listening so that they understand the context fully in order to create content that's meaningful and would resonate, they haven't been doing their job. And if a community is hiring an artist to do something and they're not sharing their stories and making sure that a context isn't provided to the artist, then the community also isn't doing their part. Does that make sense? Because when you get this opportunity to invest in public art, it's a big deal. It's not a small thing, especially permanent art that you want to live for a long time and represent your community. And while it's not branding and it's not marketing per se, there are economic development possibilities in terms of cultural tourism. There are other values, though, in terms of community and cultural development that should also be weighed as the value that can be brought to the table. I also like to think about public art and public health. And while that might sound a little unusual at first, I think there are healthful components to artists and art in the public realm, addressing the, let's just say, the unhealthy aspects of a community, or unhealthy sites that might need environmental remediation, or social cohesion. I mean, that's a health issue in communities where they're separated or divided, right? And public art has an incredible way of bringing people together and engaging people and getting people to talk about stuff they never would get together and talk about otherwise. I've seen it happen over and over again, and I do believe that it's one of those things that is special in terms of a methodology that can be employed by any community, because artists are everywhere. And yet, it's often overlooked. And it's often seen as icing on the cake, right? But the arts are not the icing on the cake. They're a key ingredient in the cake itself. So in terms of this project that you have, this incredible opportunity, it's amazing how much work you've done, and it's amazing how far you've brought MnDOT along in the process. I've worked with MnDOT, and I'm working with them now on a couple other projects in the city. And I looked at this and I thought, really? Really, they got this? And if this memo is true, and MnDOT's going to do this, and MnDOT's going to do that, I'm thinking, well, that's something. That's different. But I will say this, because I know Charlie Zelli, the director of MnDOT, and I know that they're doing this process right now called Rethinking I-94 between the cities, and they're actually slowing down what they would normally do and doing community engagement in some of the communities between downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. This is MnDOT. I know, it's crazy. Do we believe them? Do you believe that this is all going to happen with MnDOT?
We do believe it. And I just would offer a little bit of clarification for everybody to understand. The MnDOT does have some money in their corridor project for certain aspects of the amenities that we're looking at. But the city of Grand Marais got a $750,000 transportation alternatives grant.
I don't even know what that is.
That's money that can be used to pay for the amenities that are off the driving lane. So trees, benches, those things that are in the memo that you're like, really? MnDOT's going to do it? So that's what's enabling this to happen. Not just that we do have a particularly good relationship with the staff at MnDOT that we're working with, but the city also acquired a significant amount of money to pay for
And
the
how
things.
unique is that?
That Transportation Alternatives Program is broadly available to communities, I believe, for sure across the state, and it might be federal money that comes to the states, and then you apply to the state Office of Transportation. We can get you the link.
I am interested in
so you
that
can
for
learn.
sure.
Okay.
I mean, actually, I take it back. The last time I heard about a community that forced MnDOT to do something they wouldn't normally do, it was Duluth, and it was 35 coming through Duluth, which they did not want to cut off their canal. And they forced a tunnel to be added, which was not in MnDOT's plan. So congratulations to you and the city for leveraging additional support. And I'm guessing the reason that MnDOT's willing to go beyond, because they know you have the resource, number one, and it probably makes them look good if they're doing something that's more community-minded and listening, not just plowing through it with whatever basic, functional, safe roadway would look like to them.
Yeah, I would say that with the District 1 office in Duluth, that communities in this region maybe have a little bit different relationship than those in the metro with the headquarters, just because that agency is like the biggest machine in the state, you know, the number of employees and the number of miles of roads and all the responsibilities that they have. You know, that's their moving people and product safely from point A to point B is their purpose in life. It isn't benches and public art. So having the right people who can expand their engineering thinking to those other realms is essential.
It sounds like you have the right
we have
engineer
that.
to work with, which I have to say sounds golden in this situation. Now, I don't know if there are restrictions how you can spend that money, how you can't spend that money, and maybe public art isn't one of the things you can spend.
No, it's allowed.
It is.
Yep.
That's so exciting to hear, I have to say. And it's newsworthy. It might end up being a story in Public Art Review.
We'll be happy to help write the story.
You know, this is a lesson that other cities are going to want to know about, right? How did you do this? They're going to ask. So I think documenting this process is critical. I would throw that out on top of everything else. How this story from now, and maybe it's already started, how this gets recorded and shared later on, it's important, and it will help you and the future generations of people who come to Grand Marais and don't know this story. They're going to want to know too, and it's a valuable tool for education.
I think it's been just with the process itself, you know, it's been this hurry up and go kind of thing where we've had this limited timeline, and CJ, the architect, came on, when did we first, was it September? We met with him, and deliverables are due mid-December, you know, so there's been a huge amount of like, how do we do this? But now there's this stopping point where once we identify those platforms for public art, then we have more time to actually get public art here and figure out, as you said, you know, developing a public art ecosystem in our community. We do have a bit more time to figure that out, which is wonderful. All of the different amenities, the benches and bike racks and some of those things, most of them will be implemented in the next 2 summers as MnDOT works on this redesign. But then they'll just pour, you know, platforms where we request them. So maybe, I mean, it would help us perhaps, and I know this is probably a several step process and multi-meeting process to figure out, but are there specific things you see in our community or in this time frame that we should really be, you know, looking at and figuring out, along with what you've already said with RFQs and those kinds of criteria?
Yeah. I mean, you have, in a sense, created an overlay map of where you want public art opportunities and gathering places, et cetera. I mean, you've kind of done some of the work already for this particular corridor. And you could, I mean, it prompts, in my mind, what about the rest of the city, right? And you could say, why don't we do something like this for the whole city? Where are there opportunities beyond these places that in the long term, if you were to think about a public art plan to guide future development and the growth of this ecosystem here, it might be worth thinking more broadly. And then asking, how does this corridor fit into the larger plan, rather than we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to go over here, and we'll hope that they all tie together at some point. But I'd say you have a unique opportunity, given the window of time that you've kind of got now, of thinking broadly and asking yourself, how does this opportunity fit into, and what is the bigger plan, the bigger program? And also think carefully about what kind of public art program would Grand Marais like to have that includes the kind of art you're going to end up with that you, as a city, I assume, are going to have to take care of. That means a maintenance program for public art. And it probably means some kind of staff position within a city, or at least part-time, or they have to keep hiring consultants to do this work in order to develop and care for a public art program that I can easily see evolving here. It's kind of like you got a shot in the arm to start one. Now what? Right? And what does that look like? And can it include performing arts just as much as the visual arts? Yeah. And can it include the youth as well as seniors? And can it include indigenous tribes? And can it include new immigrant communities that are coming to Grand Marais? They want to live here, and they might not feel part of the community. This is what I see all over. So correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm mischaracterizing, but I see this as a pattern in a lot of communities. The people around this table is familiar to me, but they're not necessarily representative of the whole community. And this was the issue in Duluth. The Native American community wasn't even around the table when they were developing the plan. And we said, you know, we need to make sure we're not just meeting with the people in the room. And so our process for doing public art planning is literally about going to other people's meetings where they happen, not inviting people to a room where they have to come, and it may or may not be convenient. And doing online surveys and doing other social media ways of collecting input and ideas and concerns. And you know, you go down the list of how do we get buy-in from the broader community, as well as at the same time educate the broader community about what public art can be, because my experience again is most people think it's the murals, monuments, or memorials, and maybe the occasional mime. That's about it for public art. And if you don't broaden the awareness first, people don't realize what's possible in terms of a menu of possibilities. So this is where, again, having your local talent tell you what ideas they have and where they would like to do public art, and maybe even support temporary projects as an incubation or demonstration phase, so you can at least see what local talent wants to do and help them to gain a foothold, as we're talking about doing training for artists who want to get, you know, they don't want to give up their studio practice, but I'm a painter, and I could also see myself doing some mural painting. I've never been given the opportunity. I'm not sure what that business looks like, right? You can tell them what a business looks like. It's tough to make a living in this business, right? You usually have to have a teaching job or some other job on the side. So, you know, I've known Greg for a while, and he's been involved in some projects and not always gets selected, and it's tough. It's very tough. It's competitive. It's very hard to make a living, but it's easier to make a difference. And I think a lot of artists enter public art not because of the money so much as they want to make a difference with their creativity in their communities or another community. And yes, it's good if they can make money too, and that's what we're about too. So that's a business model though, right? It's a business to run. And I don't know how many of you are making a business doing your art, but it's not easy. And in a community where you rely on tourists, I know there are seasons when you do better than other seasons. So it's like the people who do the state fair. It's like, that's the 10 days we're going to make money because we're not sure about the rest of the year. And I don't know if that's the best business model, but it seems to work for some people. But my thought is, you know, how do you integrate artists into all of the different sectors that you have in this community? Have all of you heard of this idea of percent for art? So it's a concept for a funding model, right? That cities, there are some 350 of them around the country. Minneapolis and St. Paul have ordinances for public art. And it's usually, they take the capital budget for the year and say, we'll spend 1% of the capital budget on public art in relation to those capital projects. So if it's a new library that they're building, 1% of that construction budget, okay, would go to art. And even if they don't have a staff person to manage it, we might get hired as a consultant to help them select the artist to spend that 1%. The problem is, it's just for commissioning fixed, permanent public art, because capital money has to be spent on bricks and mortar. It's restricted. A lot of these communities are trying to figure out how can we broaden the kind of ordinance we have so it isn't just about commissioning bricks and mortar public art, which I have nothing against. I'm a big fan. But what about all these other potential ways that artists can contribute and all the other sectors besides the capital budgets could artists participate in? Could you have artists in residence in your schools, right? Maybe you already do. How could it improve learning in the schools if artists were to bring in their skills and work with teachers to maybe enhance some kind of math or history or social studies, right? That's just one example. Could there be an artist in residence inside City Hall? And what would their job be? Would it look like mine when I was in the CETA program? Here's your desk and a phone. Now here's the city. It's your gallery. Go do that and connect artists with the public spaces that are there. And that's your job. That would be pretty cool. How do you fund that, though? So part of the reason Duluth had an ordinance already. So they weren't looking for a public art master plan to promote or advocate for a funding mechanism. What they were trying to do was revitalize what had become kind of a lackluster and ineffective Duluth Public Art Commission that had started out with momentum, and then it just seemed to get pushed to the side, you know, and they didn't have the clout that they had, and they didn't have the private sector investment. But other cities that we've worked with, it was about creating a plan that called for a funding mechanism as well as a governance system, okay, you know what I'm talking about, decision making, as well as a management system. Those are really the three key pieces: governance, funding, and management. And so it might be a policy that gets developed. It might be that the county has already started, you know, this is an arts and culture ecosystem here, an economic driver, and they're committing money at the county level. Is that true? Is that plan designed to help leverage funding for arts and culture development?
Yeah, I mean, and Mary, you can speak to, the cultural plan is something that was written around values and hoped for outcomes for thriving, for residential thriving, and the implementation and how it becomes reality, I think, is still kind of in its infancy, I would say. I mean, there's these wonderful values that are set out about the arts and culture sector and hopes for artists in our midst, but I don't think it's gotten enormous legs on it yet.
I'm from Canada, and there's a model that I know is working in Ontario. It's called Learning Through the Arts, LTTA, that's funded by the Royal Bank of Commerce, who are working with the Royal Conservatory of Music. And they noticed that because schools were no longer funding arts education, music programs, art, etc., everything was being cut to the bone. Mm-hmm. They decided to have a program where they would train some artists to develop small little modules where they would go in as a sculptor or as a songwriter and help teach history or teach math, do little seminars a couple times a week. It was a nice program. It's really nice. And I was in it a couple of years. I know some people, artists, friends in Thunder Bay, who have been doing it for 10 years. It helps supplement their income too.
Well, Thunder Bay has a great public art program.
It does. Yeah.
pretty vibrant. So there actually is a career path for artists called teaching artists. And I don't know if that's what they were trying to do there, but you know, artists aren't necessarily natural teachers, but they can be taught how to work with educators in more meaningful ways than just come in and show us how you paint.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that sounds like
Right.
they probably helped with that, with the curriculum development. It wasn't, the artists don't know how to write curriculum necessarily.
No, and they had seminars through a weekend where they would explain different pedagogical techniques to play around, to keep the kids' interest and to get their, develop a program for teaching math or teaching history.
Yeah, and I assume it was also generating income for some artists.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it paid better than being in the studio.
And I'm sure there was reward from feeling like you're making a difference in these students' lives. I mean, this is a little taste of what I think public artists working in communities get a feel for.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah, I maybe just to follow up too, that, I mean, with the cultural plan, a lot of the initiative was toward working with the Visitors Bureau to reframe language around who we are and how we communicate that externally. And so, and there was a lot of convening that happened, and I think part of it, the goodness of it, was people being able to share perspectives and build out in a, you know, in a joint manner what they think about the county itself. Is there anything else anyone wants to add? Yeah. Are there other questions right now? Happy to run the microphone. Oh.
Good timing. Well, is everybody here familiar with the plan that Ruth is referring to, this Cook County? No?
I don't know about you guys.
So that's the other thing, and two other points I'll make. You know, when you do a plan, it's really important that everybody gets to know what it's about. And if there wasn't a rollout of the plan or a communications plan for the plan, sometimes it's like a few people know about it and many people don't. With Fargo, when we worked on the public art plan there, they actually hired us at the end to say, now help us do a communications plan for the plan. And we ended up creating like a 4-pager, not the 60-page plan. Here's a 4-pager, and we deputized commissioners to go out and do talks at community groups about the plan. And they were able to get the votes at the city council that they needed, because if the rest of the community doesn't know about it, how are they going to generate the votes to adopt a plan? And then the second part is evaluation. Like, how would you know the impact, say, an artist would have in a school on student learning? And is there a way to measure that impact? How would you know the impact the public art could have on the city of Grand Marais? And what would be your measurement? What would be your yardstick to say, if it did this, we would call it success? It's really an important question. Is there aren't many studies out there, but it is important to think about it beyond just economic impact. You know, can we see an increase in tourist spending?
So, Jack, if I might, for those who aren't familiar with the Creative Economy Collaborative Cultural Plan for Cook County, I'll tell you that it has 3 primary focus areas with a number of goals and objectives that fall under the 3. The first one being telling our story, which Ruth was mentioning. It's how the Visitors Bureau promotes the county as a destination, but it's also about talking to the people within the county about the economic impact, the spiritual, personal, all the ways that art impacts those of us who live here. And probably a lot of us aren't really even aware of that until someone points it out to us, right? It's so subtle and it just happens in a good way. The second component of the plan is working together, and that is the public and the private sector working together to benefit the artists and the impact of art and the people in the community. So it's the county and the city, it's the art business owners, it's the nonprofits, it's the economic developers, it's all of us working together in a way that we're more effective and productive because we all know what each other are doing and it complements each other's work. And then the third focus area is creating spaces, and that is housing, galleries, studios, venues, whatever it is that is determined as a need. And housing overall, not just for artists, but overall, housing is the #1 challenge that we face here, and that's the primary work of the EDA at this time. But we're talking about things like maybe live workspace that is specifically designed for artists, that has appropriate doors and windows and light and those kinds of things, as well as a community gallery, if that's something that we're missing here. We have some spaces that do exhibits, but they weren't built for that purpose, or they aren't quite right for that, so it's all of that. So those are the three components of the cultural plan: telling our story, working together, and creating spaces. And then after that, we had Art Space come here, and they did a preliminary feasibility study of venues in the county that have potential to be developed to be one of those spaces. And we've just set that aside for the short term because we have so much going on right now that we don't have the capacity to go any further with that project, but it's not off the table. And now coming up in the community, we'll have, the city's gonna be working on a request for proposals to potential developers for the space in front of the new Public Works building up where the old Tom Taboda Motel was, and for the current City Hall, because that building has served its useful purpose and we need to create a new space there. So in addition to this highway corridor project, we have those potential projects coming up which would provide spaces, not necessarily for public art, but for all kinds of other art-related things. So there's a big update on, or a review of the planning to date.
I've got a question. It's interesting having been part of the collaboration that created the cultural plan, that is now morphed into, and then morphed into working with ArtSpace, and now is morphing again into thinking about Highway 61, and it's way leads on to way, leads on to way, and what's interesting is, did we finish that back there? Did we, you know, in the sense of, so I'm kind of curious about your perspective, having seen a lot of communities that have worked on the task of, well, how do you take a cultural plan and integrate it into the fabric of your community, and how do you bring art, you know, onto this primary corridor, and you know, from the inside looking out, you go, well, yeah, we created a cultural plan, boom, geez, everybody's going to be so happy when the art shows up on the highway. And some people may go, where did this come from? So what wisdom would you have to share about, in a sense, the journey of bringing your community with you? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you understand my question?
I do exactly understand, and it was another point I wanted to make, and I sort of alluded to it, but most public art programs around the country are what I call top-down public art, right? The city decides how it wants to spend its money and commissions artists to do projects, and nobody else really knows about it except the artists who maybe get to compete for those. And it's a job for the city, even though it might be a good job and an artist gets to create a new piece, it's commission, right? But there's also the bottom-up public art, right? And how do you get more people in your community starting to think about their city as a place they get to co-create? In other words, the city isn't made for us, we get to make the city we want to have. And how do you convey that to enough people and make them believe that? One way is to engage artists in communities to co-create things that are meaningful to those communities. So they all get to participate in creating and making a difference in the built environment they all live in and share. And that could be any number of outcomes, okay? From art at the schools, where the students and their parents get involved. Schools are often, a nexus for families and, larger communities, but it's not everyone. But I've seen examples of projects that start with the schools and then expand out. I'll give you an example. We're working with Brooklyn Center, which is a suburb of the Twin Cities right now, and they want a public art and beautification plan. But they also said when we had our first meeting that they're changing out all the street banners in the city. And this was an opportunity to do something different than the catalog variety street banners. And they wanted the students in the schools to be involved in creating something that would replace the normal street banners. They also wanted the street banners to convey the incredible cultural diversity that's in Brooklyn Center. And so I had a few experiences with artists and street banners and working with kids, and I just told them some ideas, but then when it came down to it, they were on a very short timeline. We got to get this done. And so the idea that evolved was, let's have a photographer go into the schools with everybody's permission and do portraits of the students, the youth in our community, the different schools. So even though there was multiple school districts, they went to 4 different schools, did portraits, narrowed down to 40 portraits of the youth in Brooklyn Center, and they're making 40 banners that are going to go on the street with the words, I am hope, or I am the hope. The next round after that, they decided now it's going to be for adults in the city, and they're going to figure out a method for identifying or taking photographs of adults, and it's going to be I am the soul of Brooklyn Center. And then they're going to do a series with elders, and it's going to be I am the wisdom of. And at the end of the day, there'll be 250 new street banners all over Brooklyn Center that many people in the community were involved in or photographed, and media around that helps. These are the people in our community, and now they're up on the street banners, and it's a kind of public art project that utilizes an infrastructure that's already there for photographic banners that are helping convey the diversity, but also, think about the future. Here's our youth. Think about the people who are the soul of our city. That's how they characterize it, and the wisdom. And I see it as a positive first project. They haven't done any public art in Brooklyn Center. But now a lot of people will know and see because they're all out moving around. And what is that? So the key part of that is a communications plan around it. There shouldn't be any resident of Brooklyn Center or anybody that owns a business in Brooklyn Center that doesn't know what's going on with those banners, and that it's part of the beginning of a public art plan or part of a larger arts and beautification strategy. Now that's not the only way to do it for sure. But my feeling is if you have more artists working in communities and asking them what would you like to do at the park in your neighborhood, or what's an issue you would like to deal with, I'm here to work with you and help you. Not I'm going to come and make art and put it here and you're going to love it. You find that people feel respected first off, and they have ideas, and now they're in dialogues that they've never been in before, not only with the artists but with each other. And they're already starting to pick up on the idea of this social cohesion component that the process of public art has going in spades. And you can design them in ways that there's more people involved or fewer people, or it's geographically specific. So if you go to our website, you'll see a lot of these stories, or even the stories in the magazine. The fact is you don't have to start from scratch. There are so many examples of what artists have done in communities that have broadened the community engagement part. So one idea that I had, we were talking about percent for art ordinance. What if you passed an ordinance and be the first one in the country that was a percent for community engagement, and that 1% of every city department, the police, public health, safety, parks, public works, 1% of every department's budget was spent on community engagement in the city, and that artists were part of that community engagement to serve to enhance what that department's trying to do. I'm just putting it out there because it hasn't been done, and I think eventually some city's going to step to the plate and say, we want to do that, because we believe everybody should be involved, not just a few. And what could result from that kind of in-depth and long-term engagement with the residents and the people who do business there? and have much more of a transparent method. So the city and what goes on inside the city isn't a mystery to people in the city. And that people don't feel like other people are making decisions about what our city is supposed to be, and we're not involved. And the fact is, a lot of people just don't go to the city council meetings or the hearings to voice their concerns unless they're really upset about something. And that's not the best model for engaging everybody in your community and getting input in planning. So I don't know how you did your comp plan update and how many voices were part of that. A lot. So there was a huge effort, right, to make sure you got as many voices. Well, like that, sustained and with creativity. And then, you know, you kind of, again, monitor it and document it and say, how's this going? What would be the indicators we're on the right path, right? This is a new business model. How do we know if we're doing a good job? So you need points along the way to sort of pause and reflect and maybe even have an outside evaluator look at what you're doing and say, how does it compare with a year ago in terms of, say, community engaged with community building and built environment? And are you controlling the development that you have here, or is it being controlled by others? In other words, if a developer comes into your city and they want to put, I don't know, an Amazon distribution center on the lakefront, and they have lots of money, is it just, yeah, come on down? Or no, it's not that. Do you know what I'm getting at? And this is another issue in a lot of communities. They welcome any development at any cost, and they haven't thought, maybe that's not the best for what we need. And how can we have community-driven development? What do we need? And who are the, like you said, you send out an RFP for a developer to do something. That's a much better model. The city says this is what we're looking for a developer for. And hopefully you find one that's like the perfect match, and now you're starting to show the proactive kind of community-driven development. Now cities can do that, but can citizens and community groups do that too? You know, are there places in your community that you feel maybe are neglected or are cultural or arts deserts? So we talk about food deserts, you know, places where there's just no access to good quality food. Maybe not the case here, but in a lot of cities. And they identify them by data visualization. By looking at data, they can, you know, tell where are their access points. And they say, how can we fill these gaps, right? You could do a similar kind of thing here. And mapping exercises are a big part of what we do with our public art planning. We ask people, where do you bring your friends from out of town? Where are the important places to you? Where are the third places you go to outside of your work and your home? Where are the places that are lacking in your community or where you wish something would happen? And we create these overlay maps that point out what the community says they feel are needed or really excited about, you know? And that's a very valuable planning tool. And you're doing an overlay map right now on 61, but you're talking about built and infrastructural. What about social infrastructure, right? And are you creating more opportunities for people to cross the street, and is it more of a safety hazard? And has that already been a big discussion? Do you want a street light? Has that come up? Or a stop sign? You know, because the more you draw people to that edge where traffic is going by, I'm sure this isn't a new thought, the greater the risk. You know, do you want kids climbing on sculptures near the roadway? Probably not. So that could be another criteria for the kind of art that's there. It's not meant to be a close-up a climb-on sculpture. Whereas if it's in a city park, in a community, that could be the perfect place for more engaging, physically interactive artwork. Here you might need to think about them being up on poles and being more of a drive-by experience or a nighttime or wintertime. You really have to think through all the seasons and all the audiences and all the pros and all the cons in order to develop the best criteria when you put that call out to artists. So they're not designing something that's actually going to be a problem later on. It's this kind of anticipatory thinking. In the end of the day, what success looks like, right? Not, you know what you don't want too. That's also really good to make a list of the things you don't want to happen, because that's guiding the development. And then it's an iterative process. I just want to emphasize. The first project you do, you're going to learn so much. The second one, you will have made improvements because you know what didn't work out. And the third time and the fourth time. And this is something that's really important to acknowledge. It's an evolutionary process. You should not try and commission all the art at once. You should think about it in a sequence. And you should say, well, is there a way we could test the ground first? Maybe at another site for a different project, shorter term. And just get your feet wet in terms of the governance and selection process and putting out a call and seeing how the response is. And you know what I mean? You actually have the time to do that. You don't have to put it all, the risk on this corridor, which is, let's face it, it's kind of an important decision around what does get done there. And if that's not done right, it could affect and maybe have negative effect on the future of a program you're trying to build. And I've seen that happen too, where people develop a program and the first project is so controversial and everybody hates it because nobody was involved or had any say, and it kills the whole program because it gets that political. So what's the public art starter kit for Grand Marais? What would that look like? What do you guys think that could look like?
Eric Humphrey, I have a couple thoughts or questions and ideas. Back to that point, there has been some going on with the Great Places project and whether that goes forward or not. But another thought in relation to that I have is, there's quite a few empty lots in town, of which I own one, or our business owns one, and approaching business owners about getting art in empty spaces, probably thought of as a temporary basis, because sometimes there's backlash if somebody puts something nice in an empty space and all of a sudden somebody wants to develop it, and then there's blowback against that. But anyway, there's lots, the old theater lot. Anyway, that's one idea. Another question I have is, I was recently walking along the rock wall right in front of where the old hotel was between Angry Trout and Java Moose. It probably goes back to the CCC days, and it's in great need of repair. Is that being addressed in this plan?
No, but it's a good point.
Because we don't want to create art and then have that wall deteriorate and then need to take the art out to fix the wall or lose that. Because I kind of view the wall as, historic. It's pretty, it's functional, and wouldn't it be sad to have it replaced by solid concrete? And, it'd be better fix it sooner rather than later when it's beyond fixing. So that just is an idea to bring forward to probably other groups.
It's across from Java?
Well, just the lakes, the walkway, that rock wall between.
I'll have to go walk there.
Yeah, it's breaking up.
Who owns it?
That's, I don't know. Is it city property or is it state or?
Army Corps of Engineers?
Exactly.
Right. Well, it's
Yeah,
suggesting.
we'll have to figure it out.
Yeah, you're kind of suggesting, again, where a mapping exercise could be. Where are there sites that need attention? Where are there vacant lots? Where are there empty storefronts? Where are there blank walls for murals?
Yeah.
You could map all of those. It doesn't require you do anything about them all, but you at least say, okay, we can at least document and have a database around these.
Yeah.
And then
So I'd love to
who
have
wants
public art in my
support?
space, yeah.
Who wants to support what? And maybe you would like to be involved in supporting something in a vacant lot you have a stake in.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's about managing people's expectations. And I like to use the word demonstration project or pilot project. And when you brand things that way, people don't go, oh, we thought it was going to stay here. We love it. No, we always told you it was just a demonstration project. And what can we learn from it, right? What did we like? And if they don't like it, well, it's going to be gone in a few weeks or a month. You know what I mean? This is the value of temporary public art, I think, as part of a planning process. You can test the waters. You can do surveys. What did you like? What didn't you like? What could you learn from that? is found object sculpture something, or folk art something, or art made out of natural material specific to Grand Marais and its identity? These are some thoughts I was having as I was driving up here. There's such an abundance of natural material. Couldn't it be used to make art with? You know, and then you cut a lot of the cost for artists if it's found material or raw material that is readily available for demonstration projects. And then, okay, yeah, you have artist fees and all of that, but it could just be a thematic approach to, say, a series of demonstration projects that's pretty cost effective. Or any number of scenarios we could play out. But I would want to make sure that when you're thinking about public art for Grand Marais, is what is it about Grand Marais that's inherent in the art? Or you could rephrase that another way. Can I know that that art has something to say about Grand Marais, or conveys the goals of Grand Marais in its larger long-term vision? And if it did, and it was related, would it resonate in Grand Marais? And people would know that here. They wouldn't think it was just brought here from Duluth and it looks good, but that's it. And might that be the litmus test of success for public art here?
One thing I thought about in response to Greg's question, I think it would be helpful to get like articles in the paper letting people know that there's art coming, there's things happening, rather than having it appear and then all of a sudden there's blowback and let's halt everything, and as we people aren't necessarily engaged in the process and don't know that something's happening. But if there's teasers out there, then there's less of a chance of public opposition once it starts happening, I think.
Yeah, I would say in terms of this Highway 61 opportunity and how to make sure the community knows about it and gets engaged in it, if you all agree that this is an opportunity to start building a public art program for the city of Grand Marais, and that this is the story to tell, we have this incredible opportunity to do something special on 61, but we're using it as an opportunity over the next year to get the whole city to think of itself as a venue for artists' creative expression. And we want the whole community to give us their feedback as to what that sounds like to them. What are the possibilities that people see in this community? What are the concerns that people have? What is the value that it could bring to Grand Marais? And ask everybody you can, just like you did with the comp plan. Because if those questions haven't been posed to your community, you don't have a lot to lose by asking them. It might really inform what you do along Highway 61, but also what you do in the rest of the community and how those things might relate to each other, which, as I said before, that's a golden opportunity to have a connection between the main corridor and what happens on both sides of it for your city.
And I guess one final question I thought of when talking about the county plan, the number one point is telling our story. And recently we've had so many, in the last 15, 20 years, so many international workers in town who don't know our story. And I think for people coming to the area, it would be nice to get some basic information out to all these folks. So, when a tourist comes in to my store and asks somebody, oh, what was life like here? What started the community? Oh, I don't know. How's that for engagement? And so it'd be,
Right?
and it's probably not the forum for that, but some of us maybe sit on other committees or groups that could work on that, and that's just one thing I'll toss out there.
Collaboration for a number of
Yes.
groups.
So anyway, that's 2 cents.
I was just going to say, maybe hinging on your question about, what our group thinks as the toolbox for Grand Marais, maybe just a starting point in that is to put you on the spot very lightly and go around and say, what's your takeaway, in a sense? Like what, as you've heard Jack talk, and we still have more time, but it might just help us to, if it's a word, if it's a concept, if, what sticks out to you as we've been sitting here talking for the last hour and a half?
Without having too much time to actually think about the question, I hear a lot about community engagement and Which I think is a good idea, but I also heard the, at one point you mentioned it even, from my personal experience with public art, and public art doesn't necessarily mean that it's paid for with public funds. It can be public art paid for by private or corporate funds or grant money. But you get too much engagement in it, you really do get a watered down piece of art. And in fact, you'll find that there will be a certain level of artists that will apply for that project for that purpose. You end up with not a real descriptive piece of art, as opposed to something that comes, right out of an individual artist's vision. And somewhere in that process, and I'm sure Greg's had some of the same experiences. You qualify through one process, and then perhaps there's some meetings, and then there's a follow-up with models or drawings. And at that point, you can either stand by your design, or you can allow the committee to redesign your project.
Right.
And that is something that I think is important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I would
is
just
that
clarify.
It's not a art by committee.
I was just going to say, there's a big difference between community design public art and community engaged planning that informs an artist with their own vision, so that the context, again, of the place where they're creating something, they have a lot of research and input to guide their vision that's being created. And once their vision's done, no, it's not about bringing it back to everybody for their input and change orders. That would be a community design public art, and I'm not advocating for that. So when we hear the word community engaged, we might all have a slightly different perception of what that might mean. For an artist right now, I was just at a committee meeting yesterday for the airport, Minneapolis Airport. The artist, Jen Lewin from New York, who does this incredible interactive light sculpture, the airport said, we want you to get the community engaged. Like, this is the airport. But her idea was to do some surveys and ask people, what are the words that come to mind of the different seasons in Minnesota? And she just gathered, impressions, because she's from New York. And so for her, it was just about tapping into sort of the pulse of what is Minnesota, and how many times lakes were mentioned, and how many times, the crunching sound of snow and things like that. You can't tell looking at the art that she designed that was there, but it informed her and gave her some sense of, and people felt like they were giving something to the artist to help them do their work. But every artist is different and would want to set, like I'm sure Greg has done, parameters around what kind of input and engagement would help them. Yeah, but it's a good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the going around the table, but it's really an important thing to think about when we talk about community engagement. There's 100 varieties of what that looks like.
Yeah, you got my head spinning a lot of thoughts, but I think the bottom line is, this is a real launching pad for Grand Marais. Not just what piece should we put there, but it's what's going to happen next. Is there a viable sort of public art program that can now start or happen because of this, and does that fall on the art colony? Does it fall on this group? Who or where does that begin or start, or do we have a seat at the city council meeting every month? I guess that where does that begin, or where does that entity bubble up from? Maybe it's just Ruth. No, I was kidding. But as we see these opportunities and the idea of pushing it to Wisconsin Street or pushing it up the hill, who is going to be the go-to group next year and the next year and the next year, or small group or person? I think we have to seize the opportunity.
Yeah, and I'm sure with the planning that happened for the county plan, who was involved in that? Who cares about seeing it go further? Would they like to continue being involved? It's key that you have different stakeholder voices at the table and not just, say, the arts colony, even though they're an obvious stakeholder. But I would guess it's not a new thing here to figure out who needs to be involved in a planning process, and then have it open to others that want to they don't want to be on a committee, but they'd love to come, sit in or listen in.
So maybe just keeping on that same sort of track, I think many of the people that are involved in the CEC, the Creative Economy Collaborative, were involved in creating the cultural plan, which came first. The Creative Economy Collaborative came next. The agreement of the city council that the CEC should become the advisory board to the city on art came next. I think we just keep rolling on this path that we're on. And the one thing that I think is really interesting, how many of the things that you talked about, Jack, it's like, yep, we're doing that, oh, we didn't do that, we better put that in the mix, you know, so it's, you're affirming some of what we're doing and informing us of other things that we need to be thinking about and doing, appreciate that. I lost my train of thought. When we were going through the process of dialogue with the city about what kind of role the CEC would have with the city council, there was discussion at one point that maybe the CEC should be an appointed board of the city, like the Parks Board, or the Planning Commission, or the Public Utilities Commission. And as we looked around the table and observed who was participating, we saw that like probably between 20 and 30 people show up every month at the meetings of the CEC. And if we needed to appoint people to go forward that were citizens within the city limits, we wouldn't be able to come up with a handful of people, because almost everybody that's participating in the group is coming from reside in other places in the county, not within the city limits. But they are the people that have both the talent, skills, and abilities to do the work. So it's an interesting, even though it's right now the focus is within the city limits, the group is not within the city limits, and I really think has a much broader vision than just within the city. But we agreed that we would start there because it was a confined space and maybe easy for us to take our first baby steps and have some small successes and then build upon that and take it out more broadly. So I think we have a long-range vision, and I feel like there's long-range commitment from a lot of the people that are participating, and I think that's just another thing. Yesterday we had Senator Bach and Representative Eklund and Commissioner Phillips here from IRRB, and I toured around the county with them for 3 days and showed them a whole lot of projects and introduced them to a whole bunch of people, and I wish I would have counted how many times they said, we don't see people working together anywhere like you guys work together here in Cook County. It's amazing, the community that we have here. So we need to remember that and be proud of it and own it and continue. And I think that's our greatest tool in our toolbox.
Yeah, and I would imagine these are stakeholders around the county who believe Grand Marais is a huge resource for them. So that's a really interesting point that you're making about people who might not live in the city limits, but caring a whole lot about what happens in the city. Yeah.
One idea I thought of as things were being raised is we have a group of downtown business, mainly downtown business people that get together about once a month and, you know, talk about events and planning and whatnot. And, you know, if artists want to get art out in public spaces in private businesses, that would be a primary forum. So, you know, Mary and Ron attend these meetings, and so that'd be one idea that I have.
Well, it's been super helpful to me to just kind of broaden my thinking about, you know, what kinds of things we could be thinking about. I tend to get in my little ruts of experience, and so it's pretty great. And I'm especially taken with the idea of the community story, and that the art can reflect more about, you know, where the community came from. I mean, I'm looking around and realizing that Eric's the only local, you know, that has a couple generations behind. My parents bought the place I am, and my kids grew up here, which is probably the next longest term person here, and that kind of, there's that voice that I see more in maybe the old, further back generations of residents. That's like, well, I don't know how dominant this is, but there is that voice that says, why do we even need a fancy highway? It was just fine. Why do we need to raise our taxes? And us paying more tax money is huge. It's a huge, complaint, where almost anything that's, that feels like imported or, arty-farty or fancy stuff. That's out there too, and I think that's skillful, the idea that there could be, skillful ways of connecting with the range of voices, that I tend to not be in that circle very much. So, I'm in my happy place, and it's easy, but I just think it's really important to remember, the Native community is really different than the, more recent import white community that just has a different set of experiences. Anyway, it's so good to think bigger and in the connection of all of us.
I think I probably come from a little different perspective. I'm sort of on the periphery of this. I'm on the art colony board. This is my 5th year, and so I'm very tied to that. I'm an artist. I live in the Twin Cities, but I'm up here every month. So I feel like I'm in this sort of straddling place between these two worlds, and I see all these possibilities and connections, and I'm really excited I follow what the CEC does, so I'm not out of the loop in that way, but it's very interesting to hear what you have to say. I feel like, it's just a way to tie everything together and get everybody on the same page and thinking about these things and about, the different community stories, but whose stories are we telling? And looking at those things and the idea of temporary work and bringing people in to work in this very special environment. I think it's a very unique place, and like you say, all of the materials are there. So I think that's something we can offer that many places can't, and I'm so thankful to everybody who's put in all the hard work on this. I know this has been a real long-term commitment, and thank you for coming up and sharing your perspective as well. So thank you.
I was going to say, with what Mary was talking about with the CEC, I think also the fact that it's an open group is pretty fascinating as a cultural experience and experiment to say that this is kind of it's a working group and there's been a lot of work in it, but it's open still where a lot of committees are not. So there's this empowerment there that happens. I'm really intrigued by the ordinance you proposed and would love to research more about that for the city and for the county and what that looks like. I would agree about, Lynn, as you say, whose story are we telling, and in the sense of who are the marginalized, where it's funny to think about cultural deserts within Grand Marais, but certainly that's that mapping sense of what does that look like is a new, I think, thought in some ways for me, because I associate that with an urban exercise, but it's certainly something for us to consider, and that sense of the temporary public art, how can that kind of draw out different voices and help us to honor different narratives. And then I'm just really excited about what the art colony can do with its resources. I think there's ways we can stretch out what we do in new ways, whether it's class educational related or residency related or artist service related. But potentially re-granting to artists. Like, there's just all this stuff for me brewing about our artistic direction and what we can do. So I would love to keep hearing from all you what those things are, because this is our mission, and it overlaps with some of our mission, not fully, but these areas are so primed for us to utilize these programs that we've already built out. You know, how do we make those available in the community and to artists? So I'm really excited about those aspects.
Thank you. I'm a recent immigrant. I'm Canadian and from Thunder Bay, and know the public art program there for the last 20 years. Had a couple commissions there. I also initially started out in theater and loved spectacle and masks and et cetera, et cetera. And so public art for me is how the community asserts its values and its identity. Where's its spirit? Where's its heart? And in Thunder Bay, they've made some big mistakes, and they've had some successes, and they've really worked hard at their public art program. As I've been here, what I love about Grand Marais are the two solstice performances, kind of bread and puppet kind of thing. There's a live music component to it. It's generated by the kids and professional performers, artists in town, Harbor Hill players. It's fabulous. It's the heart of the community. I remember 5 years ago, for the winter performance, standing out in a snowstorm with 50 other people watching this little shadow puppet play. It was amazing, just amazing. And that's the heart of Thunder Bay for me, or Grand Marais, excuse me. It's regional, it's regional. So I feel pretty much at home here, because it's the lake and the forest. That's what makes this part of the country strong and sing, and that's the value.
I may turn out to be a little more of a devil's advocate. And maybe to pick up some on what Betsy was saying. To begin with, I was involved with Grand Marais since very young. My family's been involved with Grand Marais my entire life, although I have been in and out. I guided here back in my 20s, out of, not Grand Marais, but Cook County. And then I went, well, I was already away the rest of the year. I'm also an art historian and an architectural historian and an artist. When we came back here after a career in university teaching and consulting, I came back here with a romantic idea that had been fixed maybe back when I was young, or when I was guiding a little bit later. And I thought of Grand Marais as this wonderful place that smelled of fish and chainsaw oil. And I found out that it wasn't that way anymore. And I liked the fish and chainsaw oil a hell of a lot better than what I found when I came back. And so I've been thinking a little bit about it, and I have a sense that there are some groups who have control, or who think they have control, in Grand Marais, in Cook County. We've got a very strong chattering class, a very educated chattering class. We also have some very strong businessmen and businesswomen and business organizations. And I know that they were powerful, but I was standing out in my lawn last fall, and one of my neighbors, who's in his 80s, came up and started screaming at me because I was one of those rich outsiders who didn't know what the hell was going on and were making this place too damned expensive to live in. And he was still having to work in his 80s because of it. And he has a point. So we are in a phase of transition that I think requires that we do things very carefully. I like the idea of trial runs and that sort of thing, because we should not leave out that fellow who was screaming at me. He happens to be a good neighbor, but he was just, something had got to him. Okay.
Oh, you get to say something too. Yeah, you do.
No,
Tell us what you had for breakfast.
That social cohesion, what you were talking about, I think is something that is really important. And Betsy talked about her happy place, and that's kind of what you can end up doing here, just working in those little circles. And the more I've been here and the more people I'm meeting that are like what you've been talking about. And you're right, we need to talk and get those people involved with this as well. Do you have any kind of like ideas how to do something like that, bring people together?
Yeah, well, you always want an ordinary person around the table. And it's good to have people who push back, challengers in any meeting, I think. If everybody was, rah, we're all good, you're not going to move the needle forward very much, You need to hear from the naysayers, and you need to hear from people who don't want things to change. And you certainly want to hear from people who are afraid of displacement and gentrification and the cost of living going up. Because they're right. They are right. Things are going through transition, things are going to change, and what might be changed for the better for somebody is not changed for the better for somebody else. And you're always walking that line of, you can't please everyone, but you can look at what are the issues and what are ways you could try to mitigate some of the negatives and deal with the downside of the improvements to your community. And if it's people don't want to pay taxes, and they don't think the road need to be changed. Well, it's getting changed. You kind of have to now say, what can we make the most of out of that? So I think the key is making sure you get the unheard voices in the process for any plan that you do, but especially a plan that affects everyone. And you also want to acknowledge that everybody has some level of creativity. They may not say they're an artist or have any creativity, but I guarantee you they are making creative decisions every day. Whether it's what color clothes they want to put on, how to get their hair cut, if they're going to decorate for Halloween or Christmas. We've seen many artists come out of the woodworks at Halloween and Christmas who would never say they're an artist. And it doesn't mean they're good artists. I like to use the term we're all in the chorus. Some of us have stronger and better voices than others. But if we agree that we're all part of the chorus, we're all in this, then it's incumbent on us to do the outreach and make sure we're at least making an attempt. If people do not want to participate, but they've at least been invited and they know there's an opportunity, that's the key. They can't say they weren't asked. That's what you don't want to hear. And then you can't please everyone. We all have to understand that. And that is another reason to try out things and evaluate them, right? If you put up something that's permanent, it's much more of a challenge to try and undo that or deal with the outcome. So, like I said, maybe you have this unique situation. I don't know if you have the resources, but to say, we're actually going to do, 5 or 6 demonstration projects over the next year. and ask the community, or have a forecast come in and do a training program. And part of the training is go out and look at your city as your canvas and your theater and say, what is it you would want to do? And help the people in this community develop their own proposals for what they want to do. Even if they can't all be funded, at least you'd end up with an idea book that came from within, right? An idea bank. And you can use that at a public meeting, you could publish it in the paper, you could do whatever you want with it to make sure at least everybody gets to see what came out of a grassroots effort, not what other people want to do to Grand Marais or in Grand Marais. What does Grand Marais want to be and what is Grand Marais thinking? And I think you don't have a lot to lose by surfacing that, and you might build a sense of pride and awareness of, wow, we have a lot of creative people who have great ideas that you wouldn't even know if you didn't do the invitation to that. So in the case of Brooklyn Center and the beautification thing, they're asking me, what are some ideas? Like, can you give people awards for their front lawns if they're well manicured or something? I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but what they're trying to do essentially is adjust people's attitudes and behaviors, right? For the better, for the good, And there's always going to be somebody who doesn't want to participate. The Pigpen character in Peanuts. There's always going to be one of those, and that's part of your community too. That's part of the story too. And sometimes it's about embracing those stories as a character building exercise for your community. Yeah. But anyway, I think it's just been really fun to come and talk with you and hear where you're at. And some of your comments, I think, are right on in terms of your perceptions. And if I can be of further help, let me know.
Well, let's thank Jack for his time. I'm sure it's not the last time we'll talk with you.
Okay, good. And if any of you come to the Twin Cities and you want to do a tour or attend a session, a workshop or whatever, please let me know. We can make that happen.